Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Zero Carbon Future Pavilion hosted by the Clean Air Task Force. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Jonathan Lewis. I'm the director of CATF's Transportation Decarbonization Program, and today's event is titled Decarbonizing India's Transport Sector, How Emerging Economies Can Reduce Transportation Emissions Now. Electrification will play an enormous role in eliminating emissions from the transportation sector, but it can't do the whole job by itself. Much of CATF's transportation decarbonization work is focused on segments of the transportation sector that will be difficult or impossible to electrify, in particular heavy-duty long-haul trucking, transoceanic marine vessels, and aviation. We're also increasingly focused on countries and emerging markets where widespread vehicle electrification isn't currently feasible and might not be feasible for a decade or so, mainly because the local and regional electric grids are still under development, or because those grids carry power generated from high-emitting systems, or both. For today's discussion, we'll hear from countries and emerging markets. We'll hear from experts about options for reducing transportation sector emissions in emerging economies over the next 10 to 15 years. In particular, we'll explore the role of vehicle electrification in the world's second most populous country and its sixth biggest economy, India. During this event, we will discuss the extent to which battery-based electrification of vehicles can and cannot drive down transportation sector emissions over the next decade in India and other emerging markets. As you'll hear, regional differences matter. Strategies that make sense in one region of the world may not work elsewhere, and vice versa. In countries where vehicle electrification might play a comparatively limited role before 2035, we will examine other options for achieving near-term emission reductions needed to reduce pollution-related health damages. We'll hear first from Spurthi Ravuri, a senior associate in the Bengaluru headquartered Center for Study of Technology, Energy and Policy, where she works on a variety of issues related to urban transport. Spurthi holds a master's degree in city planning from IIT Kharagpur and a bachelor's in architecture from NIT Tiruchirappalli. She has previously worked with Senscape Architects Private Limited as a project architect. Spurthi's areas of interest include transport planning, transit network analysis, design, and urban economics. She couldn't be here in Egypt, so she will be joining us virtually via recorded comments. After Spurthi, Gopal Duleep, who is here today, will discuss his new report being released today titled Transport Sector Decarbonization in India, Are Electric Vehicles the Right Strategy? Duleep, the Senior Transportation Fellow at CATF, has been involved in automotive issues for over 30 years as a consultant for clients in the public and private sector. He has very extensive experience with issues surrounding automotive technology cost analysis and is an internationally known expert in automotive fuel economy and emissions technology. He has directed several landmark studies evaluating new technologies for vehicular engine and fuel combinations, as well as high-octane fuels in the United States and in Europe. As a consultant to the NAS committee since the 1990s, he's assisted the National Academy of Sciences in their periodic assessments of light vehicle fuel economy potential. His work on fuel economy and GHG emission reduction technology for light-duty vehicles has been cited extensively around the world. He's testified on transportation technology issues for U.S. Congress during debates on the Clean Air Act and fuel economy standards. Following Duleep, we'll hear from CATF's Director of Energy and Climate Innovation for Africa, Lily Odarno. Lily leads CATF's efforts to address the dual need of expanding affordable energy in developing economies and building a global decarbonized energy system. Her work focuses on development-centric energy transition pathways, utility markets, and technology innovation for low-carbon energy in Africa. Prior to joining CATF, Lily led the establishment of the Energy Access Initiative in East Africa at the World Resources Institute. So first up, we will hear from Spurthi Ravuri of CSTEP on recent commercial and policy developments in India.
So I'm Spurthi Ravuri, and I work as a senior associate for electric mobility at the Center for Study of Science, Technology and Policy in India. CSTEP, as we call it, is a policy think tank that enriches policy making using data-driven, evidence-based approaches. So we work across areas of climate, environment, sustainability, energy, artificial intelligence for social impact, new materials, and so on. And I'm here today to present our views on the transport sector for India. So India, as we know, is the second most populous country in the world with about 1.4 billion people residing. And she's a young country with about 42% of its population in the 24-54 year cohort. And India is a largely an agrarian economy with about half of its workforce still working with the sector. However, it has witnessed significant amount of urbanization in the recent past, with about 35% of its population living in the urban areas. So this rate of urbanization has led to emissions in the tune of 3.4 gigaton of CO2 emissions annually, or this is about 7% of the global emissions. So, and this also translates to about 2.4 ton CO2 per capita. As one of the top growing economies globally and also as a developing country, India's emissions from development are just expected to grow multifold going forward. And India is really committed to its climate change goals. As we all know, recently, India's nationally determined contributions towards the Paris Agreement were towards achieving net zero by 2070. India plans to achieve all this by mobilizing funds from developed countries, implement the actions in the view of resource required, resource gap, and build capacities within the country, and also create a framework for cutting edge technology in India and joint collaboration for R&D and technology. So currently, India has about 300 million vehicles. That is approximately 22 vehicles per thousand persons, which globally it's much lesser than what we see in most developed countries. Yet India is largely dependent on its oil consumption from through imports. 90% of its oil is imported, and transport alone consumes about 47% of the oil products in India. And this results in about 13% of the total CO2 emissions that India sees every year. And significant 42% of that comes from freight vehicles. So if you see, India's vehicle composition is largely two-wheeler focused, with about 75% of the vehicle stock being two-wheelers, whereas they contribute only up to 20% of the emissions, while the heavy-duty vehicles, the buses and the goods vehicles, contribute over 6% of the entire vehicle composition, but they contribute to 45% of the emissions. So there is a sort of a imbalance in the stock of vehicles and the emissions that they bring forward. So this is a significant challenge that India has going forward, because we are looking at different decarbonizing strategies, but we need to focus on the right kind of sector, transport sector. And as of now, India has been working towards decarbonizing its mobility sector. We have, in the recent past, we've moved from BS4 to BS6, which is equivalent to the Euro 6 emission standards, to bring down the air pollution. India is looking at promoting electric vehicles. So we have several schemes supported by the government, like the FAME scheme, as we call it, faster adoption of manufacturing in the electric vehicles, which provides subsidies for end users buying electric vehicles. It also promotes manufacturing of local components for electric vehicles, creates awareness about the benefits of owning a electric vehicle. And through these, India has set a target of having about 30% of all new vehicle sales in 2030 to come from electric vehicles, which is quite an ambitious and promising target for 2030. So to reach that target, India has recently also looked at production-linked incentive schemes for manufacturing batteries locally, advanced cell chemistry batteries locally, and also other EV components. Also looking forward to electrification in the heavy-duty vehicle segment. Like we've seen before, they are the most contributing to the emissions. So we plan to see more fuel cell and electric vehicles in the freight and the heavy duty segment as well. As of today, we have about 75% of the energy is generated by using fossil fuels, and only about 11% comes from the renewables. And but the capacity, generation capacity, is much higher for renewables. Going forward, by 2030, we believe that this is going to change, and more renewable energy capacity is going to be included in the grid. And we believe that this is going to bring the emissions down. Currently, India sees grid emissions in the tune of about 850 grams per kilowatt hour, and that is expected to come down by around 500 grams per kilowatt hour by 2030 if its uh, targets are achieved. The most promising areas of focus would be to decarbonize primarily the heavy duty freight vehicles and heavy duty buses to a more cleaner technology. So that could be electric vehicles in the near future, and maybe even fuel cells in the farther future. But also, along with decarbonizing the grid and decarbonizing the freight movement, we also need to move towards more cleaner vehicle types and not just cleaner vehicle technologies, right? So we wish to see a movement from private vehicles and two-wheelers towards public transport, which is going to reduce India's emissions significantly. We see a lot of local manufacturers like Maruti, Tata, Mahindra going towards electric vehicles for in-house or in the country manufacturing. That's a very promising trend from the industry. I believe that India is doing great in its goals of decarbonizing the transport sector. And I think the idea and the acceptance of the problem is the first step, and India is way beyond that step right now. And India has several plans in decarbonizing the sector, of which I think significant movement from private to public transport, a shift in vehicle mode is important to be, along with a shift in the vehicle technologies from fuel based to alternative fuel, electric, fuel cell electric vehicles. And also decarbonization of the grid along with these transition would really help India achieve its net zero targets by 2070.
That was a terrific setup to discuss the work that you've been doing, Duleep. For a new report that CATF is publishing today, you've done a deep dive into electrification and other emission reduction strategies for a variety of vehicle classes in the India on-road sector. Please tell us about your research and what you found. And you can use the
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to sort of build off where Spurthi left. And one thing that we have noticed in common in looking at all transport sector decarbonization is almost everyone assumes the solution is electric vehicles. And that to me is not clear when you're looking at a situation where the grid is largely powered by coal. EVs are expensive, and you have situations where customers are very price sensitive, and you have completely different vehicle types. Most developing countries, the vehicle types are two-wheelers and three-wheelers, not four-wheelers. So how does all this factor in? And what I want to emphasize is that the answers, rather than accepting EVs as the standard solution, really depends on the particular country situation, not necessarily a standard answer for everybody. Oh, sorry, going the wrong way. So we had India as a case study, and I think as Spurthi mentioned, the two-wheelers account for 220 million vehicles, and it's like 8 or 9 times the population of four-wheelers. And the commercial trucks are only about 10 million of the total of 270 million, about 6% of the entire transport sector. But another very interesting thing about India is that vehicles are very, very low cost. You can buy a standard motorcycle for less than $1,000. The average car costs between $10,000 and $11,000, which is maybe 1/3 or 1/4 what the cost is in Europe or the US. So the producers are extremely efficient in producing these internal combustion engine vehicles, making competition with electric vehicles that much harder. There are some sales in India of electric vehicles. Until last year, it was very low. All of a sudden, this year, because of big oil price increases, we've had some change in the situation, but still quite small. And what we see is that electric two-wheeler sales are about 3% of total sales. It's somewhat misleading, as many of these little electric two-wheelers are more like bicycles, very low-speed units. The sales of electric three-wheelers are close to half the market, and that's because they're mostly commercially used, either for as taxis or for light cargo, last-mile transport. And then when you look at four-wheelers, the four-wheel passenger cars, electric vehicles are less than 1% of the fleet, and that's in spite of fairly significant government subsidies that are being put in place. And as far as commercial trucks, there's almost nothing being sold, mostly buses, and those are because the government is actually the buyer. It's not feasible to be competitive on a commercial bus in terms of cost against a diesel engine bus. The second thing that I want to bring up is how the Indian power grid is. Most of the generation right now is coal-based, and the CO2 grid intensity is about 900 grams per kilowatt hour back in 2017-18. There's big plans to decarbonize, and they have made huge investments. I think that's a big story. But the second problem is that electric demand has been rising at an astronomical rate, higher than 10% a year. And so what's happening, especially this last summer, was that the grid demand was so high they couldn't even meet peak demand when solar is the highest. And what we had was a situation where the government is now reopening old coal plants because they can't meet demand. And coal is actually taking a bigger share this year than it took 3, 4, 5 years ago. So although I know the last speaker was relatively confident about meeting the goals of 2030's big reductions in CO2, the way that demand is growing, I think, will place big stress on the grid. And this last summer also, there were many power outages, rolling blackouts, etc. And if you can't charge your car during those times, I think that people will be necessarily afraid of switching to battery electric vehicles. So, you know, many of the analyses that are being presented look only at this issue of CO2 reduction. But the fact of the matter is you have to look at a lot of dimensions. And I'll spend a minute or two on this slide. First is, what is the impact on vehicle price? And, you know, this is a big driver in developing countries. Second is it cost effective to the consumer? And, you know, when people buy things, they want to get payback on it. They're not going to spend money if there's no savings. And I think the problem here is that electric vehicles still continue to be expensive. And because Indian cars are so cheap, it's like a double effect. So essentially, prices of electric vehicles in India are about twice what they are relative to an internal combustion vehicle. And the same is true for electric motorcycles. Then we look at sort of how much carbon emissions are actually reduced when you have a dirty grid. Then fourth, we look at the total cost per ton of CO2. And then look at the impact of the grid in terms of can it deliver the types of demand that are being made. And lastly is to look at regional urban air pollution and traffic issues. Obviously when you have an electric car on the street, it's cleaner, but if the electric power plant is putting out a lot more air pollutants per kilowatt hour, that unfortunately changes the situation. So just looking at each segment, what we find is when you look at two-wheelers, the trouble is that people don't use them very much. They're typically driven 6,000 to 7,000 kilometers annually, So that payback becomes quite difficult. You don't, if you're not driving so much, you're not consuming enough gasoline, then going to cheaper electricity doesn't pay you back. And the other problem is that I've mentioned this issue of low-speed vehicles. What's happening in India is that many two-wheelers are more like powered bicycles. And these are, in fact, very low cost, but they're also very low performance. And I think what has not been considered very much is what is the effect of flooding the streets with very low performance vehicles? Will they affect all the other vehicles on the street? Will they actually make pollution from other vehicles worse? Will they slow traffic down? And that's received hardly any attention world over. And then one other issue that I want to mention, of course, is that two-wheelers are notorious for the high accident rates. And the fatality rates in India are very, very high. I know people are just talking about mobility, but the flip side of that effect is the higher fatality rates that we might be experiencing. Here's a breakdown of what we see. I know it's a busy slide, but the thing to focus on is red is bad, green is good, dark green is wonderful. When you look at two-wheelers, you see a lot of red. And what all that red is that the impact on retail price is high, the cost effectiveness to the consumer is poor, the subsidy cost is very, very high relative to like a $50 a ton type estimates for CO2. So you're paying over $400 a ton approximately for each ton of CO2 saved. When you look at the three-wheeler, things get much better. You see no reds at all, some pink, which is not so great, but okay, more green, and this is where I think it is successful. And the big reason, of course, is that three-wheelers are used at about 5, 6, 7 times the rate of two-wheelers. When you look at the very low-speed vehicles, you see more green, but you see a big red, which is the big unknown, which is how do the very low-speed vehicles affect the traffic, affect the rest of the fleet, etc. When you look at four-wheel vehicles, again, very similar story. EVs are selling for close to twice the price of the regular internal combustion vehicle. Again, the driving in India is not that much. So the problem is payback again. And so it's a very similar story to the two-wheeler, except that everything's multiplied by about 10. And again, you find some improved benefit for taxis and so on, where you're driving 50,000 kilometers a year or so. But here the competition is diesel and CNG rather than gasoline. And so again, the benefits are more restricted in this case compared to a gasoline-powered three-wheeler. So again, when you look at all the dimensions, you see a lot of red. And you see a lot of red in the car side, somewhat less red in the, and more green on the taxi side. This slide to me explains why the situation in India is that even with large government subsidies, less than 1% of vehicles are electric. And to change this equation is going to be quite hard. When you get to commercial trucks or 3.5 tons, the problem is that when you get to the larger trucks, the amount of battery required is huge. The costs become completely out of line with what the situation is in India. And I think this is probably the hardest sector to decarbonize in India. And there aren't good alternative solutions, and I'll talk about that. But again, if you look at the commercial truck slide, massive red. So a lot of the dimensions that we examine it on, it fails the test of can we actually make this cost effective, can we sell it to the customer, and are there benefits? One of the things that I didn't talk about is in almost every case, we find that the effect on urban air pollution, or regional air pollution, I should say, is worse with electric vehicles simply because the coal plants are so highly polluting at this point. And so you have a net negative on air pollution at the regional level. And let's remember that NOx and PM are regional pollutants rather than local pollutants. So if electrics are not such a good idea except in certain specific sectors, what are the alternatives? And you really have the three big options. One is improving fuel efficiency by using improved conventional technology. Second is the hybrid electric vehicles, which is quite popular in some countries already. And third is reducing the carbon content of the fuel. And of course, in most countries, that largely means ethanol. And that whole discussion of ethanol is, I think, a little bit too long for this particular speech. And I'm not going to discuss that in any specific detail. But I will discuss the first two briefly. If you look at fuel efficiency improvements, compared to going electric or even to hybrid, this is always the path of lowest cost and highest benefit to the consumer. What we find is that there are a range of technologies available. The majority of them will pay for themselves in 3 years, less than 3 years usually. And these can be adopted. They have been adopted in many countries already, and the technology is flowing to India. So what we find is approximately 20% improvement is possible through conventional technology, both for cars and for two-wheelers over the next 10 years or so. On the commercial truck side, you're starting from a much more efficient turbocharged diesel engine, so the benefits are somewhat less, perhaps in the 12-13% range, but still a reasonable benefit for the short term. When you look at hybrids, and of course the penetration in India right now is very low for hybrids, hybrids of course are not a good technology for two-wheelers, just too complicated for a $1,000 machine. But one thing that is good is a simple stop-start device. Much of India, traffic in India is so bad that vehicles are stopped quite a lot of the time. And if you just turn the engine off and do stop-start in a two-wheeler, that can, and two-wheelers are largely used in urban environments, very, very limited use for long-distance driving, that in fact it produces a very good benefit under these circumstances. And if you look at the four-wheeler market, it turns out that the strong hybrid like the Toyota type system is probably too expensive for India. There are very few of those being sold. But what has happened is that there are much more new technologies coming out in hybrids. Hybrids, of course, come in many flavors. So what we see is the mild hybrid that provides a 12 to 15% benefit at much lower costs, typically under $1,000. The problem, I think, with medium and heavy-duty vehicles is that hybridization is not a good solution for India as of yet, mainly because the costs are very high and the benefits are much more limited. Part of the reason is that you are starting from a much more efficient turbocharged diesel engine, which is roughly 25% more efficient than a gasoline engine, so that the hybridization marginal benefit becomes much smaller. And so as a result, costs versus benefits don't pan out for the average consumer. So let me conclude by saying that first, don't assume that electric vehicles are the best solution regardless of country and regardless of where you are. Regardless of country and regardless of where you are. So if you have a country where the electric grid has very high CO2, then I think the issue is that the benefits from electric vehicles become much more limited. And in fact, there are other competing technologies that offer you similar benefits at much lower cost. And I think what we see is that alternative strategies, that is technology improvements, hybridization of some sectors, offer a much more cost-effective path for short-term reductions, at least until the grid emissions start to come down significantly. And then lastly, I want you to leave with this, and that's because we've been seeing so much talk on low-speed mobility and last-mile mobility, and these little electric two-wheelers that offer that are relatively low cost and offer this last mile mobility could come at a very high price. That is, you might start to see death rates spiking, and I think our next speaker will talk about that. It's exactly what's happening in Africa. As Africa moves to two-wheelers, we are seeing a big spike in traffic fatality rates and so on. So last mile mobility may be good, but the side effects are going to be hard. And the other aspect of it that's hardly any notice has been received is that you flood the streets with very low-speed vehicles, what does that do to the rest of traffic? And the rest of traffic essentially slows down enormously and creates more pollution from other vehicles, sort of counterbalancing any net positives you might have. And there are obviously solutions and ways to deal with this, but that requires a lot of effort, and unfortunately little thought has been given to that effort. So let me leave that with you, and we'll come back to this. Jonathan.
Thank you, Duleep. You raised a lot of issues that we'll return to shortly, but before we do that, we're going to hear from our CATF colleague, Odarno, who is going to talk about the implications of your research and your report on other emerging economies, including, and particularly, Africa. So Lily couldn't be with us today, but we'll queue up her video and give it a listen.
My name is Lily Odarno. I'm the director of the Energy and Climate Innovation Program for Africa at Clean Air Task Force. My work at Clean Air Task Force focuses on the dual need to expand access to modern, clean, reliable, and affordable energy in Africa, while also thinking about Africa's role in global decarbonization goals. Our work at CSTEP looks closely at the current challenges that emerging economies in Africa confront: urbanization, rapid economic growth, and how we reconcile that with the need to decarbonize our global energy systems. Yeah, so the transportation sector, why does it matter for emerging economies and specifically for countries in Africa? We've been able to hear from our authors of a very striking report today, looking at opportunities for decarbonizing India's transportation sector, and I think we've been able to glean some important lessons from the paper. The first one being the fact that in rapidly evolving economies, in contexts like Africa and India, where we are seeing huge shifts in urban populations, we need to think very creatively about the transportation sector and what decarbonization within the transportation sector in these areas is going to look like. Secondly, infrastructure matters. The type of grid systems on which we are building or trying to build cleaner transportation systems matter. And so we need to think about how we decarbonize more broadly as we think about electric vehicles as a pathway forward for decarbonizing the transportation sector. In Africa, we are seeing shifts in urbanization and development, which is very similar to what you may observe in places like India. By 2030, for instance, estimates are that the African population is going to overshoot that of China. We are going to have more people living in Africa than in other parts of the world. Transportation is critical infrastructure that is needed. Are we prepared for what lies ahead in terms of aligning transportation needs with our global decarbonization goals? I think there's much that's left to be done. The story that is told of India and the experience with or the opportunities for electric vehicles as a transportation decarbonization lever. Same story can be told in some parts of Africa where we have a heavy reliance on fossil fuels. Look at most of the North African countries. Countries in West Africa are still very dependent on grids which rely on fossil fuels of various types. However, we do see some opportunities in some parts of Africa. In East Africa and in some Southern African countries, we have fairly clean grids. In Ethiopia, in Kenya, in Zambia, in Mozambique, we have some of these countries with over 80% of their electricity coming from renewable energy resources. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done in thinking about government strengthening the infrastructure that is needed to make this possible. In many parts of Africa, we still have challenges with utilities being able to provide reliable power at cost-effective prices. This is something that we need to look at very seriously if we want to look at transportation electrification as an opportunity in these areas. How do we align work within utilities? How do we align the place that our grids stand to be able to support this emerging opportunities that we are seeing. But we are seeing some bright spots as well across these areas. So in Rwanda, for instance, the government recently announced tax exemptions for EV sales. In Kenya, we are seeing the government working through a national and a society which is a voluntary organization, but is basically positioned to help support the development of electric vehicles, looking at three-wheelers in Kenya, and working with them to be able to create opportunities for youth to take part in the manufacturing of these systems. I think the opportunities that we see there in East Africa at all these, when we look at all these countries which are considering EV opportunities, is the opportunity for us to localize the technology development, opportunities for us to localize the innovation that supports the expansion of the sector. So there are some clear opportunities there. Heavy trucking is also a big opportunity in East Africa and across all parts of Africa. Many of you may be familiar that the African continent has recently adopted the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We are hoping to see more open markets across Africa. We want to see goods move from South Africa to Northern Africa, from East Africa to West Africa. We want to see an open market in Africa. This means huge demand for transportation, especially in the trucking sector. And so it's important that as we have global conversations around what we do with these transportation sectors, which may not necessarily be easy to electrify now, that we think about the African continent. It's a huge opportunity there, and we should be reining in the opportunity within Africa into these broader conversations as these evolve as well. I think the simple answer for me would be yes. And I say yes because of where Africa is going in terms of how we are integrating our markets and looking to build one huge African regional economy. The African continent is huge. And if we had to think about what happens in our ports, if we had to think about even inland transportation, huge opportunities for us to think about zero carbon fuels. The question for me, and I think it perhaps applies to other parts of the world, is when are we going to be able to take advantage of these zero carbon fuels at basically at scale and at cost-effective prices? The challenge then would be at what cost? And do we have the supporting infrastructure to make this possible? And if not, how can we make these more concrete aspects of the climate and decarbonization conversation? Energy access is one part of the conversation, but I think we need to think about other things. Transportation, we need to think about the industrial sector to be able to have a systems view of what the opportunities within Africa actually look like. I don't think we are there yet. And I think that could be an important agenda, both for climate action, but also thinking about the transformation of Africa's energy systems as we move forward.
So I'd like to use most of our remaining time to build on some of the points that our speakers have raised today and delve into a couple that we didn't have an opportunity to discuss. And I'd like to start with a point that Spurthi made about the significant reductions in carbon intensity of India's electric grid that are expected to occur by 2030. In your presentation, Duleep, you mainly focused on the grid as it exists now, which has a fairly high, very high carbon intensity because the grid is supplied mainly by coal-based power. My question is, what can India's transportation sector do to cope with the current limitations of the grid while also preparing to take advantage of the benefits of reduced carbon intensity as they materialize over the next decade or so?
I think the main factor that we ought to look at is whether these improvements actually happen. I know that people talk about it. Excuse me. People talk about it, but there have been huge barriers to having these decarbonization technologies being adopted at the volumes they want. One thing we are seeing is that some of the easier projects in solar and wind have been done. The rest of the stuff just gets harder. And total electric demand is growing so fast that we have to think of what actually might happen by 2030 rather than a more idealized picture. But in the meantime, I think hybrid technology offers a bridge because many of the same things that you need for electrics are needed at lower volumes by the industry at cheaper sizes and so on. So the battery sizes are smaller, but same battery. The motor sizes are generally somewhat smaller, but also electric motors, electric motor technology. So I think it does, in fact, provide that bridge between 2022 and 2035.
In our discussion with Lily Odarno, it went on, there's a lot more to it than what we were able to present today. One of the remarks that fell out of the recording that we presented was had to do with the safety of micromobility. This is a point that you brought up as an issue that India is starting to look at and consider. She noted that accidents involving two-wheelers in Africa, particularly in Uganda, where she has looked at some at research, shows that two-wheeler deaths associated with two-wheeler accidents are becoming a principal cause of death within these regions, particularly again in Uganda. And she asked, how do we begin to think about an urban development strategy and an urban expansion strategy that is able to document and track the reality of urban expansion in terms of transportation and is adequately prepare for it? She connected the need to build better passageways or roadways and infrastructure for two-wheelers with the need to bolster grid infrastructure to provide power to those vehicles, which are potentially two parts of a broader challenge. So I know you've given some thought to safety questions around the increase in two-wheeler and three-wheeler usage. What can be done to address those safety issues in India and perhaps other emerging economies as the use of these vehicles explodes into the market?
I think safety has become a much bigger issue in India lately. The accident rates in road transport are crazy high. They're typically 5-6 times the US rate in absolute terms, but if you look at it on a per vehicle basis, it's even higher. And much of the cause is two-wheelers. I think even in the US, for example, or in developed countries, two-wheeler fatality rates per vehicle are much, much higher than four-wheeler. So the limitations of having such a system where you're very dependent on two-wheeler would mean that you either have to have ways of separating the different streams of transport or simply accepting the fact that these death rates are going to be high and try and mitigate them more through road safety improvements, wearing helmets and so on. But it's a big question, one that's received very little attention in many developing country markets, and one I think that's also receiving very little attention in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions.
Thank you. Your report identifies among the solution set that might help reduce emissions. You want to put it on that side? That might reduce emissions in the near term. Your report identifies hybridization, particularly mild hybrids, as a key useful strategy. You and I had a conversation with a major OEM a couple years ago in which they expressed surprise, concern, frustration around the uptake of hybrid vehicles in the light-duty market, despite clear cost advantages, clear cost benefits to the consumer. That may be changing globally. So and I want to check in with you on that. Are we seeing a higher level of uptakes in hybrids, mild and strong, in global markets, and in particular in India?
We have not seen that in India yet, but what's happened in Europe is amazing. I think close to half the vehicles now are mild hybrid. Many car companies have focused on mild hybrid as the technology with which to comply with European greenhouse gas emission rules, other than, of course, pure electric vehicles. And Toyota has already made the strong hybrid a standard feature in almost all of its vehicle lines, and sales rates are increasing very rapidly, maybe doubling in just the last 2 or 3 years. Now, with this recent increase in fuel prices, I think we're seeing a big run-up in hybrids, even in situations like the U.S., which has long enjoyed fairly low cost for fuel. And so as fuel costs rise largely, we are seeing major increases in hybrid penetration.
And that those developments could be driven by India manufacturers as well?
I think much more so in the mild hybrid side. I think the strong hybrids still represent quite a large challenge, at least in the near term, maybe the next 5-7 years, for changes to be happening within the Indian market. And that's largely because vehicles are so low priced.
For the strong hybrid, plug-in hybrid context, and particularly for straight electric vehicles, the vehicle technology is part of the challenge that needs to be solved. Another part of the challenge is delivering electricity to the vehicle itself. A lot, yeah, as you mentioned in your chart, a lot of these vehicles can be plugged into standard wall sockets. However, that's not necessarily the most efficient or even sometimes the safest way to charge millions of electric vehicles. What's the status of charging infrastructure in India? What needs to be focused on in order to support, in the long term, a broader use of electric vehicles?
Most of the two-wheelers are, in fact, being charged just from the regular wall socket. The batteries are quite small, and you can recharge a two-wheeler in 3-4 hours just from a standard wall socket. The issue with cars is starting to become an issue in India, just because so far Indian four-wheeler or car sales with electric vehicles have not been large, and it's just happening now in a small way, but even already it's becoming a little bit of an issue as to how to charge these vehicles reasonably. The number of public chargers and the number of superchargers, the one that can charge your vehicle in an hour or less, a four-wheel vehicle in an hour or less, is quite small in India. Big plans by the government to increase that, but with the grid being so unreliable, I don't know if the timing of this is right. Perhaps they need to wait a few years and make the grid much stronger before embarking on and recharging infrastructure push.
Thank you. So, Spurthi, you and Lily all mentioned heavy-duty transport, long-haul heavy-duty trucks in particular, but we haven't spent a whole lot of time on them. As you know, the Clean Air Task Force's Transportation Decarbonization Program is in many ways focused on segments of the transportation sector that are going to be hardest to electrify, including heavy-duty trucks. We're gearing up some research in the United States and in Europe on what we think future market segmentation will be between petroleum fuel trucks, and that market share will likely come down. And going forward, what portion of long-haul heavy-duty transportation services will be provided by battery-powered vehicles and what will be provided by zero-carbon fuel vehicles, most likely hydrogen-powered fuel cell trucks. Incidentally, we think that the market segmentation in Europe and the United States will likely look very different. And so I'm curious to discuss that sort of long-term issue in India. presumably, we will, India long-haul transport will move away from petroleum fuels, maybe not. What do you see as the role of zero-carbon fuels and batteries in comparison as complements to each other in the heavy-duty truck sector?
I think this is a tough one to answer at this particular juncture, just because it's so uncertain even in developed countries that transferring technology now to a developing country situation becomes that much harder. It's almost definite that the heavy truck sector is going to lag the other sectors in terms of quick greenhouse gas reductions. And zero carbon fuels are already starting to make some impact in certain situations. The one area where electrics could make sense is in trucks that do delivery on a regional basis, perhaps drive on the order of 150, 200 kilometers per day or less. And those are the only ones that I think battery electric vehicles could potentially make sense. But even here it's quite hard because the amount of battery you need is so large that you lose how much the truck can carry. That's reduced, and the costs are also quite high. So as a result, I think we need to try and focus on next generation solutions. These could include, for example, trucks that pick up electricity along the roadway, like a trolley bus, which might be a very interesting solution for certain particular high-density corridors. Or we could look at ammonia as a particular energy carrier and that can be used on with engine technology, combustion engine technology, and of course fuel cells, which probably are still 15, 20 years away in a developing country context, at least 10 years away in a developed country context.
Your point on the possible utility of catenary trucks that are connected to overhead wires, is one that's of great interest to us. There's a lot more interest in catenary systems in Europe than there is in the United States, which again, I think comes back to this point that these different major economies are going to deliver some of this freight delivery, are going to develop their freight delivery systems a little differently. And the world needs to be prepared to accommodate, the sort of geographically appropriate and market appropriate solutions to what are, a really difficult set of challenges. Another question I want to run by you is, when we talk about the vehicles that are being electrified in India that may be electrified or use other technologies, there are vehicle classes on your chart in your analysis that don't even exist in the global north. Last mile delivery is the thing that everyone's focused on in the United States because it's this new type of vehicle that's all of a sudden ubiquitous. I mean, there is always a Amazon truck on my street now. Last mile delivery in India's urban areas, at least, is not done by a 20-foot truck. It's oftentimes done by a three-wheeler. India is the sixth biggest economy in the world now and growing. It's the second largest country by population, and it has an enormous homegrown domestic automotive industry. I'm curious to get your thoughts on how and what directions India might lead mobility technology development over the next 20, 30, 40 years, given that it is already developing vehicle classes for markets that don't exist in the global north. Again, given that most of the demand for transportation services is going to happen in the global south. Does India have an opportunity to play a leadership role in how that technology evolves?
Yes, I think so. I think the world's largest 2- and 3-wheel manufacturers are now all Indian. And they are major sources of export to Eastern Europe, to much of Africa, and some parts of Asia as well. And I think these companies, and there's only 3 or 4 of them, dominate world trends. And I think how their product planning and how they see the effects of new technology will play a major role in shaping what you've termed as last mile delivery and many continents, many developing country situations. And also, I think that the electric three-wheeler and three-wheel carts will become more ubiquitous as time goes on. And that could be a major force in changing technology and last-mile delivery.
Thanks, Duleep. So we've heard from Spurthi that India has made battery electrification the central plank of its transportation sector decarbonization strategy, a strategy that hopes to leverage the country's significant policy investment in renewables-based generation. We've heard from you that most of India's on-road sector, for much of that sector, a shift to batteries in the near term would deliver modest emission benefits at a very high cost per ton of CO2 reduced, in large part because the electric grid is still dominated by coal-fired power plants. Electrification does not make sense for some segments of the sector, particularly heavy-duty or light-use four-wheel vehicles, but it does make sense in segments that are smaller, lighter, and have high utilization rates. Three-wheelers and small four-wheelers that are used in commercial contexts mainly. For other vehicles, you identified hybridization as a useful strategy for reducing emissions over the next decade. Lily told us that the electric grid in many parts of Africa is similar to the grid in India, and that it's dominated by fossil-based generation, which in turn significantly undermines the extent to which climate and regional air quality benefits can be derived from vehicle electrification in the near term. There are, however, markets where battery electrification looks more promising in Africa, particularly in several East African countries where the vast majority of generation currently comes from renewable resources. Any closing thoughts to add to the discussion we've had today? Anything you'd like to leave us with?
Yes, I think the two issues that should be examined in greater detail is first to stop looking at solutions only in a one or two dimensional space of carbon reductions or the cost of carbon. We have to look at it from the demand side perspective. Will consumers buy this? We have to look at it from a regional air pollution level. We have to look at it from a cost benefit level. So that looking at multiple dimensions, I think, is an issue that hasn't been done very much historically and should be a central part of the conversation. Second, I think the recognition that global solutions are not uniformly or cannot uniformly be applied to all situations, that looking at each individual country and assessing these dimensions for subsectors of transport is a much more detailed and much more productive way to look at the situation.
Thank you. And thanks so much to all of you for joining this session. I want to particularly thank Spurthi Ravuri and Lily Odarno for making time to join us virtually. And I want to direct everyone to the CATF website, www.catf.us, where you can find Duleep's new report on decarbonizing transport emissions in India. That's on our website. You'll be able to find a recording of this event on our YouTube page. And again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I hope the rest of your day goes great. Take care.